Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Joseph Fielding Smith was a bit of a lightning rod in the fact that he wrote some, what we would say, politically incorrect things about blacks today. So we'll talk about the controversy. Dr. Matt Bowman is the author of Joseph Fielding Smith, a Mormon theologian, and so we're going to dive into that controversy, as well as a few other controversies involving Lowell Bennion and Ezra Taft Benson. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. The other uncomfortable topic, I think, is his writings about blacks. Can you talk about that?
Yeah.
Especially with regards to the priesthood ban.
Yeah. A lot of this is in, as you said earlier, right, The Way to Perfection, which is his account of the human spirit and what happens to the human spirit from the pre-existence to the afterlife. And in that volume, he quite explicitly states that he subscribes to the theory that people born to African descent were less righteous in the pre-existence. And he uses all sorts of pretty egregious language. They were not entitled to be born white, etc., etc., etc. So he is very much, I think, a kind of defender of the racial restrictions in the church. I think one of the most influential exponents of that particular idea, which goes back to Orson Pratt, right? The racial restriction is due to pre-existent. Back to Orson Hyde, I should say.
Yeah, I was going to say.
There was a Pratt-Hyde thing again. We did that earlier, right? Going the other way. But yeah, that idea that goes back to Orson Hyde, right? That black people possess souls that are less righteous in the pre-existence. Fielding Smith becomes a major exponent of that idea. He has some fairly prominent clashes publicly over the ban, in which he's the defender of it. One of the most famous of these is, of course, with Lowell Bennion, the church educator who was then working at the University of Utah Institute, and he and Fielding Smith have an argument about the ban in front of a lot of other church educators at a big church education symposium in the early 1950s, and that eventually leads to Bennion's dismissal at the hands of Ernest Wilkinson, who was both president of BYU, but also had this wonderful title of Commissioner of Church Education, right? So he was over the institutes as well as being over BYU. He and Bennion had a very cold relationship for years and years. Wilkinson believed that Bennion was far too liberal on issues of race, among other things. And the Fielding-Smith collision really helped to instigate Wilkinson's ultimate decision to fire Bennion.
Oh, so I always thought that was Joseph Fielding Smith, but it's more Wilkinson that was involved in that? Wilkinson
is the hand that rocks the cradle, as we might say. He's the one who does it. But Wilkinson does perceive Fielding Smith as something of an ally on these things, on some things, although not others. For years, Fielding Smith was on the committee of apostles supervising BYU, and he was strong-willed. Wilkinson was strong-willed. They did sometimes butt heads over things, even though they were sympathetic ideologically. Ultimately, though, I think the blame for Bennion's dismissal lies with Wilkinson.
Okay. There was another letter I remember seeing from my cousin who had it, a letter about President Benson, who in the 1960s was called on a mission to England, I believe it was, or Europe for sure. And Joseph Fielding Smith wrote that when Benson comes back, I hope his blood will be purified. Can you talk a little bit about that dispute a little bit more?
That is a letter that does exist. That's in the University of Utah archives. Yeah, and I think this is interesting, right? Because it points to
because they were both conservatives, right? So you'd think, this is conservative on conservative.
Yeah. That is the thing, right? That I'm about to say that what we tend to think, I think, especially kind of more liberal-ish members of the church will think like all conservatives march in lockstep in all ways, and that's just simply not true, right? You can find some real deep divides among even in what we might call the conservative camp. And this is one example of it. Fielding Smith is a Republican, right? He's a Republican from his youth. He's actually he begins identifying as a Republican when Theodore Roosevelt is president, which will show you kind of how long his life is, and the meaning of the word Republican changes a lot over time, right? But Fielding Smith, although he is a Republican and he would have said a conservative, he believes that Benson is being inappropriate in two ways. The first is Fielding Smith is pretty, I think, skeptical that the church should get much involved in American politics at all. And this, I think, is an outgrowth of some of his conservative impulses, right? Which is to say, he is skeptical of the world outside the church. He is skeptical of authority outside the church. He really believes that members of the church should be first and foremost members of the church. And so he finds Benson's real kind of fascination with politics kind of distasteful and sort of inappropriate, I think, for an apostle to be so interested in electoral politics. It's unseemly. It's disreputable. He also thinks that Benson is a conspiracy theorist. And it's important, I think, to separate, theoretically speaking, conservative politics, like Dwight Eisenhower is a conservative, right? But Dwight Eisenhower is not a conspiracy theorist, from conspiracy theory. So you've got like conservatives, of which David O. McKay is certainly one as well, right? David O. McKay also is a Republican and would have considered himself a fairly conservative Republican, but McKay's not a conspiracy theorist. Benson's a conspiracy theorist. And Fielding Smith finds that vaguely embarrassing as well. And so, when Benson is sent off to Europe for a few years, Fielding Smith hopes that this will all work out of his system and Benson will come back and be what he should be, which is to say an apostle, not an aspiring amateur politician.
To go on a tangent with Benson for just a moment, I remember talking to Matt Harris, because he's written 2 books on Ezra Taft Benson, and I said, and I'm going to pose the same question to you, I said, so how would Ezra Taft Benson feel about Donald Trump? So I'm going to pose that to you.
That's a fun question. Yeah, it's just so. I don't know what Matt said, but the sort of historian answer is that that's almost impossible to tell because circumstances have changed so much, right? And I do think Benson shared, and somewhat with Fielding Smith as well, this basic sort of anti-elitist suspicion and this sense, right, that there are shadowy elites kind of running the country and we need to get rid of them, right? Benson absolutely believed that. And that's where you hear, I think, in kind of Trumpist politics, this sort of old conspiracy theory, right? And much of, I think, Trumpist politics is based on conspiracy theory, and Benson certainly had sympathy for that. I also, though, think, Benson came up in a time in which even politicians who espouse conspiracy belief had to kind of meet certain standards of decorum. And Benson certainly felt that. I think he probably would have found Trump personally quite distasteful.
Yeah, that's what Matt said.
Yeah.
Matt Harris, yeah. Yeah, he said that personally, Benson would have had a lot of problems with kind of the family values or the lack of family values that Trump exhibits. But yes, he's definitely would probably have been open to the conspiracy. Matt also said that the pro-Russia, Benson would have had a real hard time with that.
That's a very good point. Yep. Yeah, that's, I think, an interesting way to kind of think about politics, right? Regular standard issue politicians tend to think about politics in terms of problems to be solved, right? We have poor people. What do we do about poor people? We're in a Cold War with Russia. What do we do about that, right? And that's conventional politics. Conspiracy theorists think about politics in terms of people. which is to say there's a shadowy elite group out there, and all our problems are the fault of the shadowy elite group, and if we can get rid of that elite group, then everything will be wonderful. And you see a lot of that in Benson. You also see a lot of that in Trump, right? Trump doesn't think about politics in terms of problems to be solved. He thinks about politics in terms of enemies and allies. Enemies to be destroyed, allies to be rewarded. And then somehow Trump thinks, if you do that, then all the problems that we have will just work out themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Benson thought about politics in much the same way.
Yeah, interesting. I'm trying to remember what else is there. What have we missed talking about Smith, Joseph Fielding Smith, in your book? We've talked a lot about the books he's written, his growing up, being grandson of Hiram Smith, and that sort of a thing. What are we missing?
We could touch on, if you like, the last chapter in which I talk about this idea of orthodoxy.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Stuff like that.
Let's do that.
So one of the cases I make right in that last chapter is that Fielding Smith, in many ways, I think, developed the idea of orthodoxy in the Latter-day Saint tradition and in the LDS Church particularly. Orthodoxy is an old Protestant idea. It goes back to John Calvin particularly. And the idea of orthodoxy is one that I think a lot of people take for granted now, which is simply that to be a member in good standing of a faith tradition, you have to believe certain things. And that if you don't believe those things, then you're not going to be saved. Right, that if you don't believe the right things, you're not going to go to heaven ultimately. That's not really a Roman Catholic idea. It emerges out of this sort of particular wing of Protestantism. And it's not really actually a Latter-day Saint idea for the first century or so of the church's existence. Salvation for Joseph Smith and Brigham Young meant ordinances, right, being sealed, endowments, stuff like that, which had a sort of loose connection to belief. What Fielding Smith starts to insist in the mid-20th century is that belief is actually really important. And it's very important to believe the correct ideas because he is afraid believing the incorrect ideas will lead ultimately to you going not to heaven, ultimately. You can ruin your salvation if you believe the wrong things. And he gets this, I think, from the controversies around Protestant fundamentalism in the early 20th century. And he begins to import it into the church. And so you see, I think, with a lot of the fights he has with some other general authorities and with lay members of the church like Sterling and McMurrin, his attempt to defend this idea and to promote this notion that correct belief is very important to being a good Latter-day Saint.
Okay. I want to push back on that just a tiny bit because in my studies of early Christianity, it was Bishop Irenaeus who talked about orthodoxy and having correct beliefs, and we should have 4 gospels because there's 4 corners of the earth and some strange ideas like that. But, and the Gnostics and those other bad Christians, they didn't have right belief. And I mean, Irenaeus is probably pre-Catholic a little bit there, but doesn't that come back a little bit with Catholics too, and especially with Vatican I and Vatican II?
That is a very, very good point, right? Early Christianity, and I'm glad you said, right, pre-Catholic Christianity, because what you really see, I think, here is in the early Christian church is that it's actually a mistake to think that there was an Orthodox Christian position in the early Christian church. There wasn't. There were a lot of different Christianities that all fought with each other. And certainly, I think it is right to say they fought over ideas in some cases, and particularly, I think, ideas about the Trinity. And they thought about these ideas about the Trinity because they feared, because certain ideas about the Trinity were associated with certain ideas about society and about politics. Right? And it almost didn't matter which, right? So in some ways, what eventually became the Orthodox vision of the Trinity, which is to say, right, 3 persons, 1 substance, the Council of Nicaea version of the Trinity, is associated with the Roman Empire and with Constantine. And so anti-Nicaean ideas about the Trinity, Arianism and the rest, are associated increasingly with groups that are like subversive of the empire, especially the Germans, right? The Germanic hordes, who are for the most part Christian by the 4th, 5th centuries AD, they tend to be Arian, not Nicene, right? So these ideas certainly are present in the very, very early Christian church. By the time Roman Catholicism, well, by the time we enter what we might call Christendom, right? This point in time after the fall of the Roman Empire, and when the Roman Catholic Church becomes more or less kind of dominant in Europe, you really see by then, in part due to a lack of literacy, but in part, I think, due to just sort of the nature of society at that point, your average Roman Catholic would not have been able to enunciate for you the nuances of the Council of Nicaea.
Right.
So most people, right, they're illiterate, they are being taught often by art, which is why cathedrals are so decorated, right? These were kind of teaching methods for teaching people about Jesus. And the real emphasis is on having people take Mass, having people be baptized, having people undergo last rites. The real emphasis is not necessarily on educating your average person in what Orthodox Christian doctrine is. Now, that becomes the case, though, in the Reformed tradition. And that's the tradition of Protestants, right, that break off from Roman Catholicism, and especially led by John Calvin, who do really believe that one of the major flaws of Roman Catholicism is that they are not enforcing correct doctrine enough. And so you see the big push among Reformed Protestants. And the Puritans are a really good example of this, right? They are in the Reformed tradition. They want to teach everybody how to read because they want everybody to read the Bible. And they want everybody to read catechisms. And they want everybody to learn correct doctrine. And literacy becomes a major part of that.
Okay, so correct doctrine is really out of the Reformation, then, is what you're saying.
But yeah, in the modern kind of period. Now, certainly you do see in the Council of Trent, for instance, the Catholics kind of catch up on this, and in the Council of Trent, they do start to say, well, maybe it's important that our priests at least understand the Nicene Creed. And it's, I think, kind of amusing, the fact that the Council of Trent, which happens after the Reformation, and it's kind of Roman Catholicism trying to pull itself together after the Council of Trent, they do place a really, really big emphasis in the Council of Trent on training priests and teaching priests correct doctrine. And of course, what do we learn from that? We learned from that they actually weren't really doing that with priests before the Council of Trent, even with priests, right?
Oh, that's funny. So, since the Reformation, especially with like Vatican II, would you argue that the Catholic Church does have more of an emphasis on correct beliefs?
Well, Vatican II is interesting, right? Because Vatican II is actually fairly ecumenical. And Vatican II tries to sort of, I think, throw the doors open on doctrine a little bit and to be more expansive than just doctrine. You know, Vatican II emphasizes that the church is properly understood as the family of God. And what people really need to understand is that they can be brought into the family of God largely through the liturgy, through sacraments, right? So certainly there is doctrine that should be believed and all of that, but the real emphasis of the church is on promoting the sacraments and bringing people into the church through performing these sacraments. And certainly they might be educated, right? But their education in correct doctrine is not as significant as sacraments are. Sacraments are the real key thing that need to be performed for people.
Okay. So, as we look at Smith, do you see? I guess I would argue in the 60s, 70s, 80s there was this real orthodoxy push in the LDS Church. I think we could probably blame that on both Smith and McConkie. Has it become a little less emphasized, or is it just one of those cyclical things where we're up and down? Where do you think we are headed?
So what you see, right, I think that it's really kind of fascinating, is that when Smith enters the Quorum of the Twelve in 1910, right, he's sort of alone. He's on a bit of an island. Many of the other members of the Quorum of the Twelve are people like Talmage, who enters the council a little bit after that. John Whitsoe, these people who are really interested in science and really interested in kind of promoting a broad vision of what their church might be. By the time Smith becomes president of the church, most of the members of the Quorum of the 12 are people who he mentored, and people who look up to him. And this is people like Harold B. Lee, like Mark Peterson. And they're the real kind of movers and shakers on the council, and they're the ones who believe in the ideas that Smith has been teaching. And that is why I think you begin to see, as BYU begins to be reformed in the 1950s under Ernest Wilkinson, you see in the religion department at BYU this real push by, and a very explicit push by people like Harold B. Lee, who go to BYU and who tell the religion faculty, you need to be teaching Joseph Fielding Smith. You need to be teaching man his origin and destiny. So there's a real effort, I think, to put Fielding Smith and his ideas at the center of what it meant to be a member of the church. And then the correlation movement and the standardization of curriculum, that standardization is built upon Fielding Smith and his ideas and his writings, and then McConkie following him, right? And so that is a real period, I think, in the church, a period that lasts really through the late 20th century. But I do think, actually, you see a shift in emphasis in the church in the 1990s. And this is a shift, I think, that coincided in some ways with the realization among the Quorum of the 12 that the real rapid globalization of the church in the late 20th century, much of that is being lost to inactivity and to people being baptized and then just immediately kind of leaving the church. And they want to reorient the church, I think, away from this retrenchment orthodox position that Fielding Smith really embraced, and towards increasingly, I think, what we might call devotionalism, which is to say that being a good member of the church is about living a good life. It's about being a good and ethical person. And that is the real significance of what church teaching should be. We should not be, using or basing our Sunday school lessons on the works of Bruce R. McConkie. We should be basing our Sunday school lessons upon how to treat others well, how important it is to attend church weekly, how important it is to study your scriptures. And that kind of emphasis on devotionalism, on ethical behavior, on being a good person, I think you see that very evident in Gordon B. Hinckley and Thomas S. Monson, and increasingly, I think, on how the curriculum in the church begins to change after the 1980s.
So are you saying the Joseph Fielding Smith emphasis is waning a little bit now?
Yeah, I think so. I think, of course, you saw, of course, maybe the most prominent and famous example of that was Mormon doctrine going out of print a few years ago, right? And Deseret Book no longer selling Mormon doctrine. And there was a lot of speculation, right, that was because it was that McConkie was out of fashion, and then there were statements from Deseret Book saying it just wasn't selling anymore. But
which I think wasn't true.
Either way, I think whichever one of those is correct leads to the same conclusion, right? Which is to say that the way of being a Latter-day Saint that Mormon doctrine promoted, which was an emphasis on believing the right things, embracing orthodoxy, teaching orthodoxy, that was fading, I think, in the face of a renewed emphasis on ethical behavior and being a good person. As I forget where, but as I wrote somewhere, right, bishops today care much less what your position on evolution is than whether you will drive somebody to church, right? Bishops are interested increasingly, I think, in keeping the ward running, building a ward community, bringing people in to serve in the ward, living good lives, much less on, we have to insist that the earth is 6,000 years old.
See, well, let me push back on that a little bit, because I do see kind of two things. It seems like, Elder Holland gave the Muskets talk about we need to defend the church a little bit more, which would be kind of a Smith thing. And it does seem like there's been a little bit of a crackdown at BYU. So that's why I wonder: is it more of a cyclical thing, where we got to emphasize a little bit about more beliefs, and
Yeah,
students
yeah,
are
yeah.
losing their testimonies at BYU because we're not being conservative enough, or I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I have a number of thoughts about what's happened at BYU. If you read some of what I've written in the Salt Lake Tribune recently, yeah, here is that. I actually think that that's kind of consonant with it, right? Because so much of what is happening at BYU, and this sort of concern that we see among faculty at BYU has to do with gender. It has to do less with theology than with practice. That is it acceptable to be in a same-sex relationship? Is it, what do we think about same-sex marriage? What do we do? How do we live? Right? And these are certainly, it is absolutely fair to say, right, these are certainly moral and social issues that McConkie and Fielding Smith were concerned about. I think, but they're also very much about life and living. Now, this is to say, though, right, we can separate those two things because I think absolutely, right, you see embedded in some of those impulses this renewed sense of being under siege, which certainly is characteristic of Joseph Fielding Smith in a lot of ways. And I think that waned somewhat. I think Hinckley did not feel that way while he was president of the church. He had a very kind of expansive vision and an inviting vision. But I think certainly hand in hand with the increased polarization that we see in American society today, and the sense of kind of conflict in American society today, there was absolutely a belief at BYU that secularization is coming for us, and we have to put up a fight against it, which is very much in the vein of Joseph Fielding Smith.
So are you agreeing that it's kind of cyclical, or what do you think?
I think it is taking on new manifestations, right? I do not see a renewed emphasis on a Smith-style orthodoxy, but I do see a renewed emphasis on a Smith-style defensiveness. Those are two
Okay.
slightly different things, right? Orthodoxy being about doctrine and abstract ideas about what you believe about the age of the earth and about the theory of evolution and so on and so forth. But defensiveness, I think, about the church's practices, certainly, absolutely.
And so, because the other example I wanted to bring up, you have the 1993, the September 6th, where 6 intellectuals were excommunicated, and then what is it, about 2015, where John DeLynn, Warrock Waterman, Denver Snuffer. I mean, it wasn't really like it wasn't a repeat of the September 6th, although they were pretty close together. Not in the same month, but it does seem like there was maybe a defensiveness. Uh, and I mean, some of those are different issues. I get it, but I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, quite different issues, I think. I think a lot of, well, especially Kate Kelly and John DeLynn, right? A lot
Right.
of these excommunications, I think, are about issues of gender, and about issues of practice, which of
As
course
opposed
is
to belief, is what you're saying.
yeah, which is, and you see actually, I think you saw in some of those statements, right, that members of the church are free to believe what they wish on these issues, but they are not free to organize, and I think Kate Kelly's excommunication was largely about organizing and mobilizing, and building a community, and John DeLyn's was too, I suspect. I
Okay.
mean, yeah, as much about those sorts of things, which is not to say you're wrong, right? I'm not saying this is, it certainly is premised on a kind of defensiveness. I'm mainly kind of interested though in these ideas of theology and,
Okay.
and what theology is and how central theology is to the church. And I just don't know that it is as central to current leaders of the church as it was to Joseph Fielding Smith.
Could we argue that instead of theology, like Smith was concerned about, that it's more politics? Because gender's kind of a political issue now, right?
Well, and what's politics, right? Everything is politics in a sense, right? But I think you're on the right track here, right? Which is to say, it is as much about how people live, how our society is organized, especially kind of issues of gender, right? How do we organize around gender in the church? That is the real third rail right now.
Okay. Okay. Well, very good. Do you have any last thoughts about your book,
No,
Joseph Fielding Smith, a Mormon theologian?
Yeah, no, not so much. That was pretty exhaustive, so thank you.
All right. Well, I am going to be giving away a free copy, maybe autographed if I can make it out to California this weekend. Go to
Hopefully,
gospeltangents.com/contest. You could win this book right here. And if I get out to California, I'll try to get it signed. And it was a fantastic book. I loved it. I thought it was great.
thank
Learned
you
a
so
lot.
much.
So thank you, Dr. Matthew Bowman, the Dean of Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University. I really appreciate you for being here on Gospel Tangents.
I appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
Mm-hmm. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Matthew Bowman. Matt, thanks again for giving me an extra copy of this book so I could give it away. And just for the amazing conversation. It's always fun to talk. In our next conversation, I'm excited to introduce another author on the revelations of Joseph Smith with David Hawking.
Which is what we'll be talking about, which is the revelations of Joseph Smith in chronological order.
Yes, which I think is awesome.
Which is, in other words, it's the unfolding of the restoration real time.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.